Law kids, it is time to learn about the branches of government. For a lot of you, this will feel like a review of some stuff that you learned in grade 10 civics. But it's part of our study of law because we need to know where the law comes from and who makes it and how much power they have and how they all balance out that power. That's really what the branches of government are about. Um, in our Constitution, power is divided equally between three branches of government: the executive, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Say that after me: judicial. It's not judicial. Okay. And so every branch has its own unique powers. And the idea is that no one part of the government becomes more powerful than the other. And that, and they sort of cancel each other out sometimes. If they make bad decisions, one other branch will be able to correct that. For instance, if the legislative branch passes bad legislation, then the judicial branch can strike that down. The executive branch has a lot of power, but the legislative branch can act as a check on that power. So it's the same as sort of the American concept of checks and balances. Let's see how we do it. So in Canada, the executive branch consists of the key leaders of the business of the government. These are the people that carry out the day-to-day business of government. So they make the major decisions and they implement them. Now, who's at the top of the chain? Before I go to the next slide, who do you think is the highest ranking official in the Canadian government? If you said the Prime Minister, you're wrong. Actually, our official head of state is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II of England. She is technically our head of state. That's why she's on our money. Um, but of course, she doesn't really hold any real political power. It's not as though she can wake up in England tomorrow and say, "Oh, I think it would be amusing if I made all of the Canadians wear purple socks on Thursdays just for my entertainment." She can't, like she can't do that. I'm sorry for that terrible impression, but she can't do that. She doesn't have legislative power. However, she does have the power in her country to call together Parliament and say it's time for them to meet. Um, she does have the power to appoint lords and ladies to the upper chamber in Britain, and she does have a long-standing tradition of having tea with the British Prime Minister once a week to discuss government business. And although she's not allowed technically to try to influence the government, she does provide her advice. And one wonders what it's like to go into a meeting with the Queen of England. Of course, when she started doing these meetings, she was a young woman that only weeks prior had been a princess, and her first meeting was with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. So I imagine in that meeting, she was the one that was intimidated. But can you imagine being Boris Johnson and going in to meet with her and to know that she has met with all of the prime ministers going back over how many years? It must be a very, very interesting position. Can you tell I'm a fan of the Netflix show The Crown? Yes, yes, I am. So obviously, the Queen can't be here to do any day-to-day work in the Canadian government, and so she has a representative that does it for her. And her name is the Honourable Julie Payette. And yes, she used to be an astronaut. Pretty cool, huh? So she is the current Governor General. She lives in that beautiful mansion on the right called Rideau Hall. I was lucky enough to go in there once. It's amazing. And so she performs all of the ceremonial duties on behalf of the Queen when the Queen can't be here. Of course, the Queen has visited many times, but it's Julie Payette who will do things like summon the federal parliament or provincial legislatures to meet. She will be the one to officially name senators. She's the one that the Prime Minister has to go to in order to trigger an election. He has to actually go over to Rideau Hall and ask her to sign a document to dissolve Parliament. And also, she has what I call, this is just a Tosh expression, she has the magic pen. And so when a law has gone through all of the stages that it needs to go through in Parliament and in the Senate and in committee, the final step before a bill becomes a law is the Governor General taking her pen, putting it on the paper, and signing it. And that's the moment that you sort of like ring a bell and go, okay, this law is now in effect. She also does a lot of ceremonial duties. So there's this thing called protocol. I don't know if you know about it, but when world leaders travel around, like when kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers and emperors, go to different countries, the tradition is that they have to be met with by somebody of the same rank. So if the Queen of Jordan, for instance, came for a state visit in Canada and she got off the plane and was greeted first, the first person to shake her hand was the Prime Minister of Canada, that would be a real bad trip up in political protocol. A queen should never be met by a prime minister. A queen should be met either by another royal or, in this case, by the royal's representative. So she gets to host a lot of fancy parties. She reads the throne speech when a new session of parliament opens. She meets a lot of dignitaries. And actually, if you Google her, there's quite a lot of controversy about her right now because apparently she's not treating her staff very well. And that's the tea. And you didn't hear that from me. You can go look it up yourself. Anyway, you've all heard of the Prime Minister, and you know, of course, that he is the next ranking official. So check it out. Like, there's actually two people above the Prime Minister. But in terms of real political power, this is where it is. The Prime Minister, of course, is the leader of the political party that has the most seats in the House of Commons. Remember something really important. This is a key difference between Canadian elections and, say, American elections. When we go to vote in the polls, we're not going to see Justin Trudeau's name on the ballot unless we happen to live in the same riding or constituency where he lives. He runs for MP in that riding, and the way that he becomes prime minister is by being the leader of the party that elects the most MPs. But there's no direct vote in our country for prime minister. He is the most powerful person in parliament, in part because he's able to give away so many jobs. So he provides recommendations to the governor general about the appointment of a whole bunch of people. And really, the governor general doesn't say no to the prime minister. Whoever the prime minister nominates to be, say, ambassador to Ireland, the governor general is going to approve that. If he recommends the appointment of a senator, the governor general is going to approve that. But look at all the jobs that basically the prime minister gets to give away: senators, judges to the Supreme Court and also to the federal court, ambassadors. There's so many decisions about jobs that are made by the prime minister that he actually has a full-time staffer, probably more than one at this point, called an appointments secretary, whose job it is to just compile all of the resumes and help with the searching for people to fill these positions. And of course, the prime minister, well, technically the governor general is the one that calls the election, but basically she waits until the prime minister comes and asks her. But we also now have in Canada federal legislation that determines the date of the election in advance. The prime minister always has the option to call the election earlier than that date, but now we have set election dates in Canada, which is kind of new and different. Now, of course, the prime minister can't do all of the work by himself. He needs a team, and that team is called the cabinet. And I don't know whether you've noticed this, but there's a lot of furniture vocabulary in Canadian politics. There's the House of Commons, there's the cabinet. When you propose an idea, you table a motion. The Speaker of the House chairs the discussion. I don't know why there's all this discussion about furniture, but there is. Anyways, cabinet members have huge responsibility for running an entire department or ministry responsible for a particular area of public policy. So, of course, there's the Minister of Finance, there's the Minister of the Environment, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, there's the two ministers that you see there on the slide. And by being a member of the cabinet, they actually acquire a whole bunch of privileges. Every MP is paid a base salary. Cabinet ministers make, I think it's about $80,000 a year more because they're doing so much more work rather than just representing their riding. They're running a ministry. Also, once you go into cabinet, you get assigned an RCMP security officer to you. You also have a driver because you're such a busy person. And so you have a special car and a driver that takes you everywhere. And of course, you have a huge staff at your ministry office that all work for you. So it's a huge job. It's a huge responsibility, but it does come with some perks. Now, the legislative branch is the branch of government that makes the laws. Of course, that's what legislation is. It's a law. The members of this branch are called MPs, or members of parliament, and they're elected by the people directly when we vote in a federal election. Now, the interesting thing is that if the executive branch loses the support of the House of Commons, so if the Prime Minister and the Cabinet can't keep the majority of the MPs in the House of Commons happy, and they all get together and vote against the government, they can defeat the government using something called a motion of non-confidence. And if that motion of non-confidence passes, the government has to resign and trigger a new election. And this is something that's happened several times in Canadian history. Now, it tends not to happen to politicians that hold a majority government, because, of course, all of their MPs will vote in favor of them. But if you get some disgruntled government members, or if the government is in a minority situation, then they have to be careful. And that's sort of the spot that Trudeau is in right now. That's why he's been striking a lot of deals with the NDP opposition leader, Jagmeet Singh. So there's two sections to the legislative branch of the federal government. The first is the House of Commons. And actually, the picture that you see here is not the room where they're meeting right now. This room is actually under construction, as is all of Centre Block on Parliament Hill. They're actually meeting in the West Wing in a room that looks kind of like this, only more modern. Anyways, if you can imagine, there are 338 people jammed into this room, all sitting pretty close to each other, which is difficult in COVID times. Yes, there have been some virtual House of Commons Zoom meetings, and Twitter got very excited a couple of months ago when, for the first time, during a parliamentary session, someone's cat walked across the screen, and it got recorded in the official records. But most of the time, this is really serious business. The Speaker of the House sits here at the front, trying to keep order, if you can imagine, among 338 politicians, all of whom are really in love with the sound of their own voice. The Prime Minister sits approximately here, and then all of the cabinet ministers sit in those front benches. And that gives rise to the expression backbencher. So if you're on the government side, but you're not really popular with the Prime Minister, or maybe you're new and you're inexperienced, then you sit in the back benches. And sort of the more influence and more power you get, the closer you get to the front benches. There's the same kind of hierarchy on the opposition side, right? The opposition leader will sit in the front row, and sort of the most important members of the opposition will sit in the front row, and the rest are backbenchers. These people up here are guests of the members of Parliament. Sometimes they come and they're recognized, and their MP will say, today for my riding, I have so-and-so with me. And then this section up here is for members of the public. And these are the guys that are running the audio video show. So what do these guys do every day? Well, they're in the business of passing laws. Now, there's a great saying. I can't cite the author right now, but there's a great saying about the making of law, and it's kind of gross, but it goes like this. It says, if you love either the law or sausage, you should never under any circumstances watch as it's being made. Now think about that for a second. What does that mean? Well, I don't know if you've ever seen a video about how sausage is made, but it's pretty nasty. Everything's kind of crammed together, and it comes out and it's a hot dog or a sausage roll. It's not pretty. Politics is like that too. Passing a law is an incredibly difficult process, and it is long and drawn out, except when it's not. When politicians decide they want to pass a law quickly, all of a sudden they can do it. But this is their day-to-day work, deciding whether to raise taxes, whether to introduce a new law, to change an old one. This is their day-to-day work. So here's 3 guys in the Mississauga area that are currently doing this work on a daily basis. None of them are in cabinet, to the best of my knowledge. One of these fellows might be your member of Parliament. And their job is fairly straightforward compared to, say, the Prime Minister or the cabinet. Their job is simply to represent the voters in their riding. And so if the voters are concerned about something and they take that issue to their MP, then it's supposed to be their job to help express that in Ottawa. Likewise, if anybody is having trouble accessing supports or services from the federal government, they're supposed to be able to go to their MP's office for help. For the most part, these guys are yes men. If the Prime Minister says jump, they say how high. There's a strict policy of what's called caucus solidarity. So if you are in the Liberal caucus, which is a funny sounding word that just means all of the elected Liberal members, it would be really awkward if any of these guys spoke out against the Prime Minister. They're expected to follow the instructions of the leader of the political party. And that means, like, if the leader says vote this way on this bill, they do. We've seen what happens sometimes when politicians say, no, I don't want to vote in favor of that. They get kicked out of the party and have to sit as independents. So, also part of the legislative branch is the opposition, right? It's not just about the government and the cabinet. There is an official opposition party. The Conservatives recently elected a new leader, and that's this guy here, Aaron O'Toole. And it's their job to pay attention to what the government is doing, to criticize them when they think that that's justified, and to offer alternatives, right? It's not enough just to say, hey, you suck. We hate all of the laws that you're passing. You have to do more than that. You have to say, if we were in government, we would do this instead. What's awesome is that sometimes you get cooperation between the government and the opposition, particularly in minority government situations. Aaron O'Toole is kind of new to the scene. It remains to be seen how he adapts to this new job and how much he's able to get done. Then, of course, down the hall from the House of Commons is the Senate. The Senate is much smaller than the House of Commons. It only has 105 senators, all of whom are appointed by the Prime Minister. So remember, these guys aren't elected. They're appointed and they serve until I think it's age 75. And they're meant to be a check and a balance against the House of Commons. The Senate is always referred to as the chamber of sober second thought. And what's funny is the implication is that the House of Commons must somehow be drunk. Well, if they are drunk, they're drunk on political power. And the Senate exists because there's a fear that when politicians make decisions about laws for their country, they often do so through the lens of, well, if I vote for this law, will I get elected next time? Or will the voters in my riding be really angry at me and vote me out? Well, if that's the only lens that you're looking through, that's sort of a narrow focus, right? Sometimes what is popular is not necessarily what's right. So the idea is that because the Senate sits independent of that fear, they don't have to worry about being elected, that they will somehow be guardians of what is right. To be appointed a senator is a pretty big honor. It's a job that you don't get unless you've done already, decades of incredible public service. Although sometimes, to be honest, sometimes senators are just appointed because they're good friends of the Prime Minister and they've helped raise a lot of money for the party. So one of the scandals about the Senate is that sometimes there's an accusation that a Senate appointment is simply patronage, right? It's just the Prime Minister putting in their friends into these positions. But technically, the Senate has the power to review bills, to make amendments. It does officially have the power to block legislation and say that a law that was passed by the House of Commons, if it doesn't go through the Senate, it can't go through. And so the Senate doesn't do this very often, but when it does, it's sort of interesting. So for instance, when marijuana was being legalized, the Senate looked at the legislation and then tacked on something like 90 amendments that they wanted to be made in order for that legislation to pass. So huge debate always in Canadian politics. Do we need the Senate? Should we get rid of it? Do they perform a valuable service? And do they really live up to the promise of representing the regions of Canada? That's supposed to be one of their main functions. Okay, so that's everything we want to know about the Senate for now. Let's move on to the next slide. It would be great if it moved. There we go. So a little bit about the legislative branch when we're talking about provincial governments. So in Ontario, we have the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, or its colloquially known as Queen's Park. It's pretty much a mirror of the House of Commons, just much, much smaller. I think in Queen's Park there's 107 members, and they're called members of provincial parliament, or MPPs. Different acronyms in different provinces for that. Sometimes they're called members of the Legislative Assembly or different things. And they are elected by members of the public in a provincial election. Now, interestingly, the provincial legislature doesn't have a Senate, which begs the question, if it's not necessary at the provincial level, is it necessary at the federal level? And of course, you can argue either side of that debate. The leader of the provincial government, of course, is known as the Premier. And in Ontario right now, that's Doug Ford. So we've talked about the executive branch and the legislative branch. What's left is the judicial branch. So you can see it has a root word of justice. So obviously it deals with the courts. And the job of the courts is to apply the law and to interpret the law. They can tell us what it means. So is the law constitutional? Or if somebody disobeys the law, what should their punishment be? And as we learned recently, one of the most significant powers that the Supreme Court of Canada has is the ability to strike down a law that they find unconstitutional. So, for instance, for many years in Canada, abortion was illegal. Or same-sex marriage was illegal, or prostitution, as it used to be practiced, for lack of a better expression, was illegal. Actually, prostitution itself was never illegal. That's why I'm stumbling on my words, but lots of things associated with it were. And on all of those issues, challenges were brought before the courts to the law itself. And so the types of cases that go up to the Supreme Court are not just cases of, I think sometimes people think the Supreme Court hears really big murder cases. Like if it's a mass murder, it goes to the Supreme Court. No, it doesn't. It starts at the bottom of the court system. But the types of cases that make it are ones that really focus on, is the law itself fair? And the judicial branch is the one entrusted with telling us the answer to that. So the Supreme Court, which is a fantastically huge and gorgeous and very intimidating building, and you should definitely go there someday if you go to Ottawa, is located there in Ottawa. It's the highest court in Canada. There is no appeal after this. So once the Supreme Court has made its decision, that's it. There's nowhere else to go. There are a total of 9 judges, all of whom are appointed by the Prime Minister. A very different system than the appointment of Supreme Court judges in the United States. There, they have this really detailed confirmation process, and members of Congress get to interrogate the potential candidate. And so the nomination is from the President, but it has to be ratified by Congress and the Senate. Here, there's none of that. It's a very quiet process. The Prime Minister appoints the Supreme Court judge, and that's kind of pretty much it. There was some attempt under the leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper to at least bring the candidates before a committee of the House of Commons to be asked some questions, but there was nothing that they could do to stop the appointment. So it was kind of moot, right? It was just for show. Of course, we learned recently about the history of law in Canada, and we know that there's been a huge influence in French law from the Napoleonic Code, and that legal tradition still exists in Quebec. So, of course, 3 of the 9 judges must be from Quebec. And the other power that's really interesting that the Supreme Court has is they have the ability to review decisions made by lower courts and reinterpret them based on the Constitution, or they can overturn them. So they can say, actually, down at the Ontario Court of Appeal, when they made such and such decision, they were wrong. They did it wrong. Sometimes they can also say that they found an error and send a case back down for trial. So, if you've ever watched shows like Law and Order, there's always contentious issues around whether a certain piece of evidence was admissible. And so you may have a case where the judge rules that, yes, the gun can be used at trial. And the accused is convicted based on that, goes to the Ontario Court of Appeal and says, I don't like that decision. The Ontario Court of Appeal says, you know what? You're right. Actually, the gun shouldn't have been used as evidence. The case can then go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can decide who made the right decision. So, lots of activity. By the way, the Supreme Court doesn't always sit with its full complement of 9 judges. They can sit in any odd denomination. So, sometimes, for instance, federal court cases will just be heard by 3 judges, or sometimes 5, or sometimes 7. To get the whole panel of 9 judges, you really have to bring a case that is of massive national significance. And by the way, not everybody who appeals to the Supreme Court of Canada gets to be heard by the Supreme Court of Canada. You have to apply for permission, or it's called leave to appeal, to have your case go to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they reject like something like 85, 90% of them. But they hear a huge number of cases each year. Um, Now, each province and territory has its own court of appeal, and so they can, there's a whole hierarchy, right? A case can start at the lower court, you can go to the provincial court of appeal, and then to the Supreme Court of Canada. So there's sort of 3 times altogether that you can have a case heard by a court. To take a case from the lower court all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, by the way, takes about 4 years. It's a long time. Okay, so let's pause for a second and talk about, so what? You've listened to me talk about these branches of government for a long time. Who cares? Well, the reason we care is because if we're going to study the law itself, we need to know who's responsible for making it. So if you didn't know before, now you know. Cool. And I guess the big question that I'll leave you with is, do you think that Canada has done a good job, a better job, say, than other countries at striking the balance between these 3 branches of government? I'm interested about your thoughts on that. Just a couple of extra resources for you if you're more of a visual person, you'd like to watch a couple of videos about the branches of government. If you need some review about the 3 levels of government, that's a different thing, right? So municipal, provincial, federal government, and their different responsibilities. There's a video there for you. And everything that you could possibly want to know but were afraid to ask, you can find on that last website. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.